Okay, welcome everyone. For those who may need, we do have interpretation services. If you go to the bottom of your screen, click on the globe and you can select the language that you need. Okay, and welcome everyone. This is the session Rights of Nature and Antarctica Rights, co-sponsored by the International Committee of the Green Party of the United States, the Green Party of Florida, the Green Party of New Jersey, the Green Party, the Australian Greens, and we'd like to thank the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and the 2022 Global Greens Virtual Conference Connecting for Green Action. My name is Diane Moxley. I am an attorney and an environmental activist. I am a member of the Green Party of New Jersey and a member of the International Committee of the Green Party of the United States. Our session will be in two parts. First, we will share an overview of the rights of nature. We'll share some history and also highlight Indigenous and green efforts. In the second part of our session, we will introduce you to the newest Rights of Nature initiative, the Declaration of Antarctica Rights. Our first speaker will be Winona LaDuke, two-time Green Party vice presidential candidate in the United States. Winona is an Ashinobaqua Ojibwe enrolled member of the Mississippi Band Anishinaabe, who lives and works on the White Earth Reservation. She is also the executive director of Honor the Earth and co-chair of the Indigenous Women's Network, former board member of Greenpeace USA. Winona is a graduate of Harvard and Antioch universities, a prolific author, economist, and prominent Native American environmental activist for the rights of nature and the rights of Manunan, which is a wild rice. Winona advocates for Indigenous control of their homelands, natural resources, and their cultural practices. Winona, due to connectivity concerns, has pre-recorded her talk for us today. And that talk is The Rights of Nature and the New Green Revolution. But first, we will start with a land acknowledgement by Priscilla Wahi, Director of Te Punahe Mai Tai Tini from the Center of Sustainability from the University of Otago, New Zealand. Dr. Priscilla Wahi is an interdisciplinary conservation scientist who works with Maori communities. She currently leads the Vision Mataranga search in the Ross Sea monitoring program that has partnered with Gaitahu and Invatawai. The program is responsible for examining and evaluating the effectiveness of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area in Antarctica. Thank you, Priscilla.
Oh, kia ora tātou, he mihi nui ki a tātou, kua tai mai nei, huri noa i te ao, i te ata nei, enari ko Wiremu wehi e Karakia nei. So welcome to everybody, thank you for coming, and Wiremu wehi is going to open with our Karakia.
Okay. So this Karakia is it's a very old karakia. It goes back about 45 generations to the first voyages to Aotearoa or New Zealand. And this karakia was translated by Peter Huranui Jones, who is a prominent Waikato Tainui scholar. So I'll just say the karakia and then do the translation. So it goes, whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te ata kura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu. Tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, tīna, haumi e, hui e, taiki e. So the translation of this karakia or prayer is it talks about the winds from the south and the winds from the west settling across the land. Kia mā kina kina is a kina. A kina is like a sea urchin, and it's saying the land is bristling. Mā taratara is that the sea has goosebumps. And e hi aki ana, e hi is a ray of light that cuts through the darkness and ushers in the dawn. So, and it reveals the snow, the ice, and the frost from the mountains to the sea. And the person writing this karakia, they say at the end, tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, tīna, haumi e, hui e, taiki e. The haumi is the binding of the prow of the waka or the canoe. So what he's saying is, I see this moment and I am bound to this. And then he pushes his waka out and off he goes, out fishing. So it's a very mindful karakia. It's about seeing nature, observing it, and being part of that. So it's a very good karakia. So it's done, because it's a fisher person's karakia, it's done the first thing at the beginning of a meeting. So I'd just like to share that with you, everybody. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
No. So thank you all. That's from us, and just to acknowledge all of our histories, the land that we're on, and to reflect that environmental and social justice go together. They go hand in hand to create better outcomes for all of us. So acknowledging those lands and histories, and that today is a particular day in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's our national day, Waitangi Day, where we reflect on our shared histories together. So nō reira, tēnā koutou, kamatu, that's it from us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing and being here with us today. I believe next we have our video presentation. Is that correct?
My name is Winona LeDuc, and I'm happy to be here with you today to talk about the rights of nature, land back, the rights of Mother Earth, and where we need to go in terms of jurisprudence systems. I'm here on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, in Da King Oma, which means the very land to which we belong. And I want to tell you a story about the rights of nature. Let me share my screen here. There. I think you can see it. This says Mother Earth Revolution. This is some art by Christie from Canada. I want to suggest the idea that the Holy Land is here. The Holy Land is not someplace else. It is here, Oma, a king, in this land where our people belong. This is our map of our territory. This is a Bedouin scroll map, and it's showing an indigenous worldview of the land and a map of our migration. You can see our different migration stops as we were instructed to go follow a shell which appeared in the sky to the place where the food grows upon the water. And you can see some of that here in this migration map. So what I'm going to suggest is that in the place where the thunder beings rest in their migration from west to east, also known as up by Thunder Bay, Ontario, that is a holy place. That holy places exist throughout North America, Lake Superior. This is our territory here, which is full of holy places, and here is our migration that we show along this chart in the spotted lines. But this is our territory, and this territory is itself a holy land. And then in other places where Indigenous people live, there is also holy land. This is called the place where life begins in Wichin. That is their language. That is where the porcupine caribou herd birth their young. It seems like an apt description, the place where life begins. It is also called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It is full of a good deal of oil that oil companies have been trying to get for 50 years. But it is the place where life begins. This is Lake Superior. A fifth of the world's water is in these lakes, and this is also a place where life begins. Indigenous worldviews reaffirm the relationship of people to Mother Earth in saying that, recognizing that the rights of Mother Earth are greater than the rights of municipalities or states or nations. And one would do well to observe the laws of Mother Earth, because we are all dependent upon her. An Indigenous worldview reaffirms relationship to Mother Earth and holds ourselves under accountability to Mother Earth. Now that's a lot different than the worldview that has come to this land. This is from Bears Ear territory, Dene, Hopi, Zuni territory in the middle of what's known as Bears Ear National Park. These are the Holy Land, the places that are here. And the Holy Land is also a place that is not a specific sacred site. This is the holiness of wild rice, or the sacredness of wild rice. In our Anishinaabe creation stories and our migration stories, we are told to follow a shell which appears in the sky to the place where the food grows upon the water. And that is wild rice, our most sacred monomen. And so it is also beings that are sacred in this sacred world. It is not just a specific sacred site, because around us we understand that humans were the last ones to arrive here. After all of the plants and animals had arrived, humans were here, and we are here, and we rely totally upon them. This is our traditional way. Now, this isn't really the way of colonialism. This is what manifest destiny looks like in its symbology. And that is a different worldview. That is a worldview that came with the church and said that man was superior to nature, and that the Christians could own the earth, pretty much. That's where you have the papal law that came out of the doctrine of discovery, the idea that only Christians could own the earth, and that they would own the earth and they would own the people of the earth, hence slavery and Indigenous peoples, the treatment of Indigenous peoples and the theft of our lands. This has been pretty much the practice, is the expansion of manifest destiny in the legal systems. You know, we could say that it's a long-term conflict between Indigenous worldview and a colonial worldview, maybe here manifested by these two characters in history, Sitting Bull and Custer. But it is a long time conflict between who is in charge. Is the creator in charge, or is man in charge? And Indigenous people have maintained that the creator is in charge and not man. Unfortunately, that has not been the way in the United States and in the rest of the world, where not only has the church been the first corporate landowner in North America, but following that, the rise of corporations. And there's of course, a direct relationship between the rise of the rights of corporations and the land grabs and colonial expansion. This is Harriman, one of the robber barons of the railroad, basically consuming the country in one of the first rounds of the Santa Fe and the South Pacific Railroad systems. But the rights of corporations, you know, continuing to uphold the rights of corporations and the rights of private property have increased dramatically in the United States and in other countries. And that has happened at the same time as our land has been taken. Here is kind of the consequence of what happens when you give corporations the rights to run your country. Is pretty soon, as indigenous people, you don't have much land. And in fact, most of that land is held by corporations, whether the railroad corporations or the church corporations or the federal government as an entity, or the land grant colleges who also appropriated indigenous land. There is a law passed, the Morrill Act in 1862, which gave about 10 million acres, or almost 11 million acres of indigenous territory to 52 land grant institutions to fund their endowment. A lot of that territory, a lot of that money and land came from California and Oregon, California, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, where the land takings for the Anishinaabe people and the Dakota people financed many large universities, including most prominently the University of California, which received land through private allocations from 34 treaties, and cessions, and seizures, and Cornell University, which received almost 1 million acres of land, a lot of it taken from indigenous peoples. So, you know, the rise of corporate control over legal systems and the theft of land from indigenous peoples are two parallel paths. Now, more recently, we've become concerned about how the rights of corporations are now larger than not only the rights of Mother Earth and the rights of nations, but that corporations themselves have considered persons under the law in the United States, upheld most recently by the Citizens United case at the Supreme Court. Now, what I will suggest to you, which I think most people would in common sense, is say a corporation is not a person, because a corporation does not have a soul. You have to have a soul to be a person, and a corporation does not have a soul. But countering that is the indigenous narrative on a worldwide scale, which is really questioning the presumption of rights associated with the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, and the rights of corporations. That's being challenged by indigenous peoples on a worldwide scale. So in 2008, the country of Ecuador recognized nature as an entity with legally enforceable rights, making it the first country in the world to do so. Ecuador in 2008 recognized the rights of Pachamama, our Mother Earth, to continue in perpetuity, to regeneration, to rebirth, to be free of contamination. That was the most significant legal proceeding internationally, was this initial step by an indigenous-led country, followed by Bolivia in 2010, which declared the rights of nature when Evo Morales was then president. Again, the rights of Pachamama and the rights of Mother Earth as a part of the Constitution of Bolivia. While some countries would look aside, there has been movement even in colonial countries to begin to address the rights of nature as a part of their regulatory and jurisdictional regimes. In that, in Aotearoa, or New Zealand, in 2017, was the rights of the Wanganui River were recognized. And in that, the iwi, the people who lived there, were considered to be the trustees or the guardian ad litem for the Wanganui River, recognized in Aotearoa, or New Zealand, in 2017. In 2018, the Ho-Chunk Nation General Council approved the rights of nature as a constitutional amendment. Ho-Chunk Nation is in what's presently known as Wisconsin. And in 2019, The White Earth Nation also recognized the rights of wild rice as a part of our Constitution. And in 2018, in December of 2018, the rights of wild rice were recognized, the right to regenerate, flourish, exist, evolve, and be free of genetic contamination was recognized by the White Earth Tribal Government in December of 2018. Those actions are the beginning of a shift in jurisprudence, not surprisingly coming from Indigenous nations who have not only a memory, but a continuing, since time immemorial, practice of recognizing the rights of Mother Earth and the rights of relatives, whether they have wings or fins or roots or paws, as having rights which are equal or more significant than the rights of humans. In 2020, the rights of the Snake River was declared by the Nez Perce. And in their case, the Nez Perce have battled long time the theft of fish, the contamination of their river systems by radioactive poisons from the Hanford nuclear facility, and then the dam projects along the upper Snake River. And many of those dam projects are today in the process or slated for removal as a part of the hundreds of dams in the United States which are coming down. But the Nez Perce tribe in 2020 recognized the rights of the Snake River. And in 2021, the Yurok tribe declared the rights of the Klamath River, recognizing the right of that river again to continue to exist without contamination, flowage, and the right to restoration. Now, what's so significant about this is not only the reaffirmation of Indigenous practices and thinking and jurisprudence, but also the broader implications of this for challenging the imposed right of corporations in American and other legal systems. So the Yurok tribe declared the rights of the Klamath, but parallel to that, there is also a federal set of proposals underway to dismantle the dams on the Klamath River, which will in fact protect the Klamath River as needed, or begin the process of restoring the rights of the Klamath River, particularly with the removal of the dams from the upper Klamath River. So, these changes happen, but there is no simple answer that it is not just a legal system or a set of lawsuits, but it's a social movement, and it's continuous work to protect the rights of our rivers. Now here we are back at our wild rice here on the White Earth Reservation. This is Don Goodwin and I in 2018 up on Rice Lake. This is the mother lode of wild rice on the White Earth Reservation, and this river has been fighting to protect its this lake has been fighting to protect its rights against the rights of Enbridge to run it over as a multinational oil company. In 2021, our tribe sued the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, on behalf of wild rice in tribal court, saying that the state of Minnesota had violated the rights of wild rice by its gross mismanagement of the permits that they had issued to the Enbridge Corporation and the implementation of those permits, which included the fracking of 28 rivers, the piercing of 3 aquifers, and the arrest of 1,000 people. So our tribe is continuing to pursue the rights of wild rice in tribal court. The state of Minnesota asked that case at first said that we had no jurisdiction over them, and then went to federal court and asked for an injunction, and the federal court ordered the state of Minnesota back to tribal court. And the first tribal court cases in tribal court regarding wild rice are going to be held this spring, and those are the charges against water protectors for protecting the waters of the Anishinaabe. And those cases have been remanded to tribal court from state courts. In January of 2022, Salmon sued the city of Seattle in tribal court as the Sauk Seattle tribe ruled that the rights of salmon were being violated by the city of Seattle in its, quote, green power program, which impacts significantly on the salmon of the rivers. So each of these cases and legal frameworks is, continuing through a legal process, which takes a long time. But in this process, we're beginning to recognize that it is essential that we transform legal systems from their foundational flaws of being based on the rights of the discovery, the doctrine of discovery, the rights of Christians, and the view that man has rights over nature. And now in 2022 and beyond, we are seeing the beginning of a reversal of the process by Indigenous peoples leading, in many cases in North America, the challenges to the rights of corporations over the rights of rivers and the rights of Mother Earth, the rights of salmon and rights of wild rice. But we're also seeing these cases internationally. In December of 2021, the Ecuadorian Constitutional Court ruled that the Canadian mining corporation, known as Cornerstone Capital Resources, combined with the Ecuadorian mining interest INAMI, violated the rights of nature in Ecuador. And the 7 justices of the Ecuadorian Constitutional Court that voted for this, as opposed to 2 who abstained, ordered all mining leases revoked for the Canadian multinationals as they sit on the edge of the rainforest of Ecuador. And in December of 2021, the Ecuadorian Constitutional Court ruled that the rights of nature should supersede the rights of corporations. That is kind of the lay of the land on the rights of nature. And in the years ahead, we are going to see the transition of legal systems from the rights of corporations to the rights of nature and the rights of Mother Earth. And I'm pleased to see that that is happening now. And all of us need to begin that transformation process in our legal institutions, because legal systems are functions of society. We have to remember that once slavery was legal in the United States, and now it is no longer legal. And it was once legal to destroy the planet. And now in Papua New Guinea and other countries of the Pacific, the crime of ecocide is being forwarded in jurisprudence as recognizing the rights of Mother Earth to exist over the rights of corporations. In addition to recognizing the rights of Mother Earth in these territories, Indoking and Min, our very land to which we belong, it is important to also recognize the essential nature of a land back movement to combine with that. This is a picture of my friend Karine, and she is overlooking the Bay Area as a part of the Saguaro Land Trust movement that is seeking to return federal, state, private land ownership to Ohlone and other Indigenous peoples of the Bay Area and elsewhere. This is the Bears Ear National Monument, which was restored under the Obama administration and now again under the Biden administration to a co-management plan of Native nations and the National Park Service. This is some of the federal lands. The largest landowner in the country is the government. And you can see our Indian reservations are inside these federal land holdings, but you can also see the massive amount of federal land which was appropriated from Native people that could be returned to Native people as a part of a land back movement. That could include some place like Alcatraz, which, 40 years ago, my relatives took over as part of the land back movement of the 1970s, led by Indigenous people. So this is not like a new and fresh movement of land back. This is a movement that has been going on for decades. Myself, directing the White Earth Land Recovery Project for many years, we succeeded in buying back land on our reservation that we have a maple sugaring operation in and grow traditional food and today hemp, and have a radio station and food processing facility, all part of the land back movement. Because on one hand, you could have the rights of Mother Earth, but the other part of that is that the people who need to take care of Mother Earth also need to have access to the land. And so here's a land trust that is in the Bay Area. And these are the women that are in charge of the land trust. This is the mothers of our nations. And this is a picture of a recent return of land 2 years ago. The Tuluwat Island, also known as Indian Island outside of Eureka, was returned to the Wiyot people. It was returned to the Wiyot people after it had been by the city of Eureka, after it had been taken from the Wiyot people. Most of the people were murdered. That tribe were murdered there in 1860 on the island. And the Eureka Tribal Council, Eureka City Council, City of Eureka City Council returned the land to these people. But in January of this year, the bodies that were associated with that mass murder began to be returned from the University of California at Berkeley, which has tens of thousands of bodies of Indigenous people. And so part of what we are saying is we want our land back, we want our laws back, and we want our people back to go with them. And here is in 2020 the return of 10,000 acres to the Leech Lake Reservation by the federal government. This is just kind of the beginning, but the point is that Indigenous people are about 4% of the world's population, but we are also about 75% of the world's biodiversity. It turns out that Indigenous people have far more experience in protecting biodiversity and protecting the rights of Mother Earth than industrial society or Wendigo economics. And in the times ahead, as we work together to protect our Mother Earth, to protect our water, it is important that the teachings of the rights of nature become broad teachings and broad jurisdiction throughout all nation states and municipalities. But in addition to that, and combined with that, it is essential that we have a land back movement that returns land to the people who have the experience with being the people who take care of the land. This is a picture from when Donald Trump went to the Mount Rushmore for his 4th of July celebration. And many of these people in this picture here were charged with felony charges. Most of, I believe, they've all been dropped, but at some point, Mount Rushmore also needs to go back to Indigenous people. There's no easy answer on how we decolonize. It is something that we all work towards together. And in that process, as we begin the process of deconstructing the institutions of racism, oppression, and the legal institutions which have upheld the rights of corporations over the rights of Mother Earth, we find that we have many allies. And we find that the work reaffirms life. And that is, at this point in time, with our good prayers and our hard work, what we must do. We must reaffirm life and protect the rights of Mother Earth over the rights of corporations, and protect the rights of Mother Earth for the generations ahead. Miigwech, I thank you for your time. This is Winona LaDuke from On the Earth, speaking about the rights of Mother Earth. And Miigwech.
We thank you, Winona.
So do I hit end?
And we are honored for you to have shared this with us today.
Hello.
Oh, great. And we're going to start with slide 3 on the full presentation. get that up on screen. That was just wonderful. I think all classrooms across the world needs to hear that. Okay, so again, thank you, Winona, and Honor the Earth for that. We also would like to thank the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, Center for Environmental and Democratic Rights for their assistance, as well as our sponsors, the Australian Greens, the International Committee, Green Party US, New Jersey, and Florida Greens. Understanding the indigenous roots of rights of nature and hearing about all the legal and social victories empower us in creating a revolutionary new green future for all. Greetings from the ancestral Timucua lands in present day state of Florida, United States. My name is Lizzie Adams from the Green Party of Florida, the International Committee and Eco Action Committee of the Green Party US. Just giving you a brief overview of rights of nature with some highlights of green and indigenous initiatives, which Winona has just given us a very compelling education on, including her discussion on land back. Next slide. Rights of nature is the recognition and the honoring that nature has rights, legally enforceable rights. Next. Rights of nature is traceable to indigenous understanding of nature as not property, therefore not owned. Nature has been understood as living entities, relatives that our existence is intertwined and sustained with. Many indigenous and peoples over the world see through the insanity of the destructive and moral failing colonial systems to the reality of our true connectedness. Next. Tom Goldtooth, co-founder of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, recently reminded us during our Indigenous Peoples Day webinar, not only to look towards the territorial integrity of Mother Earth, but also Father Sky. What we do to one affects the other. Next. Cormac Cullinan, who we will hear from later in this session and who led in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth that was proclaimed in April 2010 in Bolivia by the People's World Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth, states that the Declaration articulates in the legal language of the international community an entirely different worldview from that which informs almost all of our contemporary governance systems. This worldview understands human beings as members of a great community of life and as having distinct responsibilities to that community and to other beings within it. This understanding is not only reflected in the cosmologies of indigenous peoples throughout the world, it is also consistent with the contemporary scientific understanding regarding the interrelated nature of the cosmos and the functioning of our natural systems. The Declaration is also an expression of the legal philosophy known as Earth jurisprudence, which advocates an ecocentric approach to law and governance in order to ensure, and here's the best part, human governance systems are consistent with natural systems of order, because if they're not going to work. Next. It is evident in conditions throughout the United States and around the world that our governance systems, our environmental regulatory systems have failed to protect our natural ecosystems upon which our health and lives depend. Permitting allowable amounts of pollution and damage has been a useful tool for corporate destruction of our environment for profit. Rights of nature and earth jurisprudence can protect ecosystems and natural entities. Next. Rights of nature is a more environmentally protective system of law because it recognizes nature as not property to be degraded for profit. It has its own place and rights. Next. So this is the heart of rights of nature. that life forms have a right to exist, to flourish, persist, and regenerate. Next. Earth jurisprudence provides persons the legal authority and responsibility to enforce the rights of a mountain, a river, species, or ecosystems. Next. The Green Party US platform's Rights of Nature provision states legal personhood to large swaths of wildlands. And we have a lot of US Greens getting excited in this work currently. Next. So there wasn't enough room on the slide or time in our session. I wanted to highlight the rights of nature efforts around the globe, but please understand they are everywhere. They're going on near you. And I urge you to find out about these or to start your own. They're so inspiring. They're a great tool in our toolbox for the fight. Next. The Green Party of England and Wales adopted a rights of nature policy in 2016. And then in 2021, called for the adoption of a Rights of Nature Act. Greens are getting more and more involved. Next. In the US, the Ohio Greens campaign for the Lake Erie Bill of Rights helped garner votes needed for the approval by residents in 2019. And there was so much energy. I wanted to share a video clip, but I'm just going to give a shout out to Mark, Sean, Brian, Hillary, Cindy, Adrian, Stephania, Terry, and John Michael, who and more, who did such a great job. And keep it up, never let them stop you. Next. We're not going to go for that just yet. Great. And we have a quote from Elizabeth May, parliamentary leader of the Green Party caucus of the Green Party of Canada. She states that the Green Party of Canada has been pursuing rights of nature for over a decade. She says we have achieved some progress through a 2-year parliamentary committee study of the existing Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Keep that going. Next. Okay, the right to clean water. You would think everyone has it, but most do not. We all need it to live. But water is denied, despoiled, and even disappeared from our places. So let's hear now from our co-chair here in Florida about our local right to clean water effort.
Hi everyone, I'm Robin Harris, co-chair of the Green Party of Florida. In November 2020, we got the right to have clean water. Here in Orange County, Florida, where I am running for State Representative District 46, wetlands and rivers have the right to exist and flourish. Residents could sue on behalf of the natural waterway. But now we are in the largest U.S. municipal rights of nature case ever to be waged. But even so, Florida Greens are working along with allies, with plaintiff and originator of the effort, Chuck O'Neill, on a 2022 statewide constitutional amendment for the right to clean water in Florida. Will you stand with us?
Thank you so much, Robin. Legislative and legal proceedings are ongoing as we speak, but we're still in the fight. Next slide. And again, we are just all so excited about the precedent-setting case when just 2 months ago, the Constitutional Court of Ecuador decided a rights of nature win against overmining, safeguarding the Los Cedros protected forests. And this seminal ruling has applied protections across the entire nation of Ecuador. So this needs to be repeated everywhere. Next. And as Winona just shared, last month, Salmon sued the city of Seattle. We had members of the Washington State Green Party have begun supporting the Sauk Seattle Indian Tribe's right of nature lawsuit against the building of a harmful dam endangering the salmon. And we hope to hear more progress on this effort. Next. So we see the destruction around us, and now we understand that rights of nature can be an effective tool in our toolbox for protecting what we care about. But let's take a step back and consider why we are having these struggles over and over all around to protect our life-sustaining natural places. Here, Howard Schweitzer, co-chair of the Banking and Monetary Reform Committee of the Green Party US, helps us get a glimpse of a root cause of this destruction.
Hello, this is Howard Schweitzer of the Banking and Monetary Reform Committee for the Green Party of the United States. And as we see, Rights of Nature is a powerful tool for challenging the corporate assault on our world. The primary corporate weapon is money, wielded aggressively by the big banks who create the entire money supply for profit. They control a huge network of major corporations as well as the entire political system. Now they have created a new Wall Street investment class called a natural assets company. It is a mechanism to convert all biological systems into financial capital. We see this as their end game, and it must be stopped. Unlike any other party in the world, the Green Party of the United States seeks to change this system from a private financial monopoly to a public utility, funding the needs of the people and the planet, with money always going first to where it is needed the most. Money is power, which is why it must be a public system. A global movement has begun and needs your support. Thank you.
Next. So now, friends, beautiful greens, let's pause. Let's take a deep breath to open up to this broader view, a perspective grounded in Mother Earth, held in Father Sky. It is in this original indigenous cosmology, supported by what science is already revealing to us about the nature of our reality, that can lead us out of the rapacious maelstrom which we are in, what Winona calls the insatiable Wendigo economy. So I'd like to remind us of what we heard in our indigenous opening, the Karakia, that we all are the lights that can cut through this darkness, that we see this moment that we are bound in, and we have agency to act. Next. We will be turning our focus to the newest Rights of Nature initiative next, one that celebrates and hopes to protect the beautiful wild continent we know as Antarctica, the surrounding waters and the community of life that inhabit those awe-inspiring lands, ice, waters, and skies. Next. Michelle Schaeffer will be introducing our Antarctica speakers. Michelle has been the Australian Greens International Development Coordinator for 6 years. She has worked on all 7 continents, focusing on environmental and human rights initiative for over 30 years in the international and Australian NGO community. Previously, Michelle held the role of campaigns director for Greenpeace International in the Netherlands and coordinated their priority campaign projects and field expeditions in remote areas such as the Norwegian Arctic and French nuclear test site in the South Pacific. Her interest in Antarctica began in the 1980s in establishing the World Park. Take it away, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lizzie, and it's a pleasure to be here with such an important topic and such a great range of panelists. I'm very happy that our party is also sponsoring this event. I just want to start with an apology from our current campaign expert on Antarctica from the Bob Brown Foundation. Bob was the founder of the Australian Greens, so the foundation still has very strong links. Alistair Allen. They have been very instrumental in stopping the construction of a huge airstrip, a huge concrete airstrip that the Conservative Australian government was proposing. So that was good news for Antarctica because it would have been the first of its kind. So apologies from Alistair. The Antarctic Treaty began in 1961, and we had some environmental enforcements during the Madrid Protocol era, which became enforced in 1998. And what's, I think, inspiring for people working on Antarctica, in addition to the absolute beauty and the astounding natural resources of Antarctica, is that it is set aside through global cooperation to be mainly used or exclusively used, we hope, for peaceful purposes. And we even have a treaty preventing mining and all exploration there that, of course, we need to keep reinforcing. And to help us learn more about those aspects, we're going to start with our first speaker, who is Dr. Akad Aurora. He's from the Antarctic Southern Ocean Coalition. So Ricardo has a PhD is a conservation professional and independent scholar specializing in the Antarctica and Antarctic Treaty System. He has extensive field experience in Antarctica, lucky you, Ricardo, and decision-making fora. He serves as a senior advisor for the ASOC, and his main goal in his mission and his work is to keep Antarctica natural and the Antarctic Treaty System doing the right thing. Ricardo, if you would like to start your presentation, thank you.
Thank you very much. Good day. My name is Ricardo Rodriguez. Thank you, Michelle, for introducing me. Thank you for inviting me to present here today. I very much appreciated the Karakia and the earlier presentations, and I think it's a very hard act to follow, so I'll do my best. I serve as a senior advisor for the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, or ASOC, which is a coalition of environmental organizations accredited as observer to Antarctic Treaty fora. However, today I will be speaking on a personal capacity. I have been active in Antarctica and Antarctic Treaty fora for about 3 decades. And this has been a period of continuity and change for Antarctica and the Antarctic Treaty System, which I have seen as a bit of a time traveler almost. Change is now faster and exponential and global, and it is putting stress on both Antarctic ecosystems and the international governance for Antarctica. And in this presentation, I suggest, as others also, that it is time to adopt a more ecocentric view of our relation with Antarctica. Next slide, please. I'll cover 3 topics, essentially: Antarctica, the Antarctic Treaty System, and very little about the rights of nature, which we have heard, I will be hearing more later. Next, please. Antarctica is an ice-covered continent surrounded by an ocean, the Southern Ocean. It was part of the supercontinent of Gondwana, which began to break up beginning some 180 million years ago. And it became completely separated from other continents approximately 25 million years ago. Since then, Antarctica has been isolated from other landmasses, and over that time, its climate, flora, and fauna evolved to what it is now. This is to say that Antarctica has been an autonomous natural entity pretty much since birth, or actually since its birth. Our species did not exist when this breakup took place, and it would still be millions of years before it evolves, and many more years before the first humans ventured to the Antarctic region. Human presence there, although admirable in many ways, has also been problematic from early on. Antarctica was primarily seen as a resource frontier, and its marine life was heavily exploited, particularly seals and whales, and then other species as well. This resulted in lasting ecosystem impacts and eventually international tensions in the context of resource interest, the assertion of territorial claims by several countries, and the Cold War. And then came the Antarctic Treaty. Next, please. With the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, the 12 original signatory countries recognized that Antarctica shall forever be used for peaceful purposes and shall not become the scene of or objects of international conflict. So Antarctic Treaty was from the start largely a peace treaty. And among other provisions, it denuclearizes Antarctica, prohibits military activities, and freezes all territorial claims. Next, please. These are territorial claims. There are 7 claimant states. The US and the former Soviet Union, currently Russia, have reserved their claims for the future. There are 3 overlapping claims, one of which is an unclaimed area. And current and future claims are frozen and are not recognized internationally. However, claims aside, there is a de facto territorial presence in Antarctica, both by claimant and non-claimant states, aimed, for instance, at strategic positioning on the continent and the Southern Ocean for scientific research and actual or potential access to natural resources. Next, please. It is very hard to summarize the Antarctic Treaty system, but it is essentially a system of international instruments and decision-making bodies developed upon the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. And that process continues to this day. But I'll highlight some of the key instruments, primarily the ones the more relevant at the moment are the 1990 Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, the 1991 Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty. The former deals largely with marine conservation, including fisheries, and the latter with activities such as science, logistics, and tourism, as does also the treaty itself. There are 2 main international decision-making fora. I'm still back in the previous slide. Thank you. There are 2 main international decision-making fora that give effect to these various instruments. One is the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting with 29 members or parties, and the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources with 25 countries plus the European Union. The membership of this fora is not identical, but is largely the same. Critically, both fora make decisions by consensus, and decisions are made when no party or member expresses disagreement with the proposal. That implies that any given party can block a proposal, even if all others agree with it. These treaties apply to overlapping areas, shown in yellow. The treaty and the protocol apply to the treaty area, to the land and sea and ice shelves south of 60 degrees south, while the convention applies to marine areas also further north to follow the boundaries of the polar front. And this has significant policy and management consequences because there is a range of interpretations as to what these instruments do and where do they apply and to what activities they apply. Next, please. These various instruments have a promise, and I'll highlight some of them. Parties to the treaty are required to meet regularly to discuss a range of issues, including the preservation and conservation of flora and fauna. Several instruments and tools derive from this mandate. At its core, the convention, so the Karakia Convention, recognizes the interconnectedness of the marine ecosystem. Its single objective is conservation. However, conservation is defined as to include rational use, which some see as sustainable use. Any fishing must meet conservation principles based on the ecosystem and precautionary approaches, meaning that it looks not only at the single target species of fish, for instance, but at all marine species and their relations, and also aims to prevent irreversible ecosystem damage. In the protocol, the parties commit themselves to the comprehensive protection of the Antarctic environment and dependent and associated ecosystems, meaning ecosystems beyond the continent, and designate Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. And furthermore, the protocol recognizes the intrinsic value of Antarctica, including its wilderness value and its value as an area for research, essential to understanding the global environment. And also, as Michelle mentioned before, it prohibits mineral resource activities indefinitely. Next, please. But now, so far so good, but how do those instruments work together? The underlying issue is that artificial divisions between the land and the sea in Antarctica, as outlined in the various instruments as applied by decision-making bodies, make little sense for the natural world. This creates a chain reaction of problems. One is conceptual tensions between comprehensive protection in the protocol on the one hand, and conservation, including rational use, on the other hand, in the Camelar Convention. There are diverging interpretations of the objectives of these instruments. For instance, how rational use and conservation work together. In a recent paper, we illustrated this tension by referring to Relativity, a lithography by the Dutch artist MC Esker, which you can see on the right, and you probably have seen before. And it shows overlapping but separate realities, each of which respond to a different center of gravity. And in the Antarctic, increasingly, rational use is a gravity force for Antarctic marine issues. And the implication is that the area of application of the protocol has de facto retreated to the continent alone, even though the protocol aims to protect also the ecosystem beyond. The consequence of this is increased difficulty in reaching consensus, particularly on decisions that involve expanding protection, such as protected areas, particularly protected areas at sea, or climate change actions. There is still a considerable mismatch between the urgency of addressing climate change and the pace of climate action in the Southern Ocean. Now, significant climate change emissions take place outside Antarctica, but affect the Antarctic region as a whole. And impacts on Antarctica, such as ice shelf collapse, for instance, will result in impacts in the rest of the world, such as sea level rise. So Antarctic Treaty parties and countries should take whatever action they can to address this matter. Next, please. I'll go back briefly in time for a minute. Early in the 1980s, treaty parties began to negotiate a minerals convention, which was meant to regulate the exploitation of mineral resources in order to prevent competition among nations and international conflict. During the 90s and early 80s, an intensive campaign effort took place, led by various environmental groups, to prevent mining in Antarctica and to promote instead the designation of Antarctica as a world park, based on the 4 principles that you see on the screen, which is essentially wilderness and ecosystem protection, international scientific cooperation, and peaceful uses. Long story short, although the Mineral Convention was negotiated successfully, some countries decided that they would not sign or ratify it. They proposed instead to discuss an alternative agreement focused on environmental protection. And the outcome of these discussions was the protocol. Regardless of the real politics involved behind the scenes, this was a significant paradigm shift from mining to protection. As a personal note, I joined this campaign in the late 1980s, first wintering over in Greenpeace's Antarctic base through 1990, and that's me on the bottom picture on the right, and then participating in many other expeditions with Greenpeace and others. And now the entry into force of the protocol in 1998 suggested that Antarctica would be protected for the longer term. It is still protected, of course, but Antarctic governments is drifting away from those basic objectives and principles in the ways I described earlier. And I find this incredibly frustrating. I find particularly frustrating how new interpretations of agreed instruments undermine the environment and ecosystems and paralyze decision-making when this is most needed for instance, with respect to climate change action, such as, for instance, the adoption of marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean. And I know that many people in Antarctic circles are also frustrated about the current state of affairs. Next. So what's next? Antarctica is subject of much interest and activity by states and people from around the world, but is still its own thing. It existed and evolved independently for millions of years before people first set their foot there. There are long-term facilities in Antarctica, but it is still a region with no permanent populations and no life cycle societies. It belongs to itself, has always had. So there are an increasing number of cases worldwide in which the rights of nature for specific features have been recognized, and these features have become legal entities. And I'll skip here a paragraph because Winona and Lizzie have covered it very well today. So with respect to the Antarctic Treaty system, I'm personally not suggesting to throw out the baby with the bathwater at the moment, so to speak. Many important steps have been taken in Antarctic Treaty agreements to protect nature, and some of them are under threat. And many people in government, conservationists, academics, and others have worked very hard to achieve this. However, we need to return to the sources of Antarctic Treaty agreements, and actually we need to go beyond those sources and find a new ecocentric paradigm that recognizes the autonomy of nature, the essential role of nature in human lives, and also the responsibilities of people and countries with respect to nature. I think in our Antarctic discussions, we sometimes forget the essence of Antarctica as a wild place. It's more like a thing, but it's in fact a living thing. The regional autonomy of Antarctica is, in my view, a birthright in a way that is perhaps more obvious than for other places on Earth and should be preserved. I leave you with that quote, which I found interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. And if people have any questions for Ricardo, if you wanted to type them in the chat box and Ricardo could watch them and perhaps answer there. So our next speaker we introduced before, Celia Wehi. Celia is a doctor at the Centre for Sustainability at the University of Otago in Aotearoa, New Zealand. She is an interdisciplinary conservation scientist who works with Maori communities and leads the Vision Mataranga team. So Celia, looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Okay, kia ora te whānau e hui mai nei. As Michelle said, my name's Scylla. I'm a research professor, but also live within a Māori community. So I'd particularly like to acknowledge Waikato Tainui and Ngāpuhi for their support. I'm going to talk, Winona gave a beautiful introduction really to Indigenous thinking and the changes that are happening now in the world in terms of the rights of nature and how that links to Indigenous thinking. So here I want to connect that to Antarctica. So I've called this short bit of the talk Whakairoa's research, and you might be asking, what is Whakairo? And how is that research and how does that link these ideas of Indigenous philosophies to Antarctica? Next slide, please. So this is what Whakairo looks like here. You can see there is a carving that goes around this doorway. So this doorway actually is the entrance to Scott Base, which is New Zealand's base in Antarctica. And there are two men there, James York and Potama Hetaraka, and they're carvers. They're the two people who carved this particular whakairo, although there was a much bigger team. So in this research, it was part of a 5-year research project to do with the Ross Sea. It's monitoring and working out how we can both monitor and protect it in perpetuity. So this was a partnership with two tribal groups, Ngāti Wai and Ngaitahu, to whom both of these people belong. Next. So typically when we think of research, we think about writing things on paper, but actually in Indigenous cultures and many other cultures around the world, knowledge can be stored in a variety of ways. So carving is a repository of knowledge within Māori culture in New Zealand. And if we think about Māori philosophies, they centre relationality and responsibility. So those ideas that Winona talked about. So we brought these ideas to our work in Antarctica and asked, well, what does it mean to relate well? So if we centered these ideas of good relationships that we find within Māori philosophy, how could this potentially change the management of Antarctica or marine areas? So I'm just going to give you a really brief snippet of some of the thinking that went into the carving of the whakairo from the bigger team that really started to think about the management of Antarctica. Next. So here are Potama and James again. And I've also put the website there that you can go and you can find more about this project. There's a short video where you can see them talking, as well as some of the elders involved in the project as well. So they'll give a much bigger overview if you're interested. Next. But here I want to focus again on some of those ideas that I think are really valuable when we're talking about the rights of nature and why that matters. So James here is carving a bit of the whakairo, and he's carving a pattern called Punga Were Were. And you can see it looks a bit like a spider's web. That's where it gets its name from. And this pattern in particular is associated with a whole lot of ideas around interconnection, relationality, and whakapapa. So these are ideas about how we as humans are connected to all other parts of an ecosystem. Next. Potama, on the other hand, was carving the sides of the doorway. And here he's carved a pattern which really recalls the ridges in Antarctica. And what this pattern speaks of, so what they did was they spent, well, we together spent about a year working on this project, and then the carvers went to Antarctica to finish the project and spent about 3 weeks there. And what he's done is he's embedded these ridges that you can see into the carving, and it speaks of the connection that we have with the whenua, with the land that we live on or that we're connected to. So it's about the visceral connection that we need to have with what it is that we're protecting and what we are a part of. Next. And this is another pattern that Potama embedded in his carving, and it's called te kupenga, which is the net. So when you go out fishing, you have a net, and what's important here is that the size of the holes. So there's a whole level of understanding within Māori culture around the net and the way that we catch fish. And because the holes are big enough to allow the young to pass through, there are ideas that it's really important to catch only what we need and nothing more. And so the kupenga pattern has come to symbolize ideas of reciprocity and sustainability by allowing the ecosystem to flourish. And that leads to ideas about the importance of leaving something for the next generation. So ideas of intergenerationality. Next. So this is the team, and I've just put the question here, why partner? I think it's probably evident to many of you because you're here as part of the Greens conference. But one of the reasons we partner is because we have strength as a collective, and also because there are many groups around the world, including Indigenous groups, that are almost invisible in terms of decision making, and their perspectives are not heard. So one of the things that we do when we partner is that we bring those voices, which can be really transformative in our thinking. And I think that we see that, as Winona talked about earlier, in terms of Indigenous perspectives and how important they are in transforming the legal system. Next. And so when Potama and James went to Antarctica, you can see they ended up having a great deal of discussion with everybody at Scott Base, extending the ideas into a much bigger collective. And I've put here that mātauranga is something, so this is what we think of as a knowledge system, that it doesn't exist simply as knowledge, it exists also as the values, as the process of how we do something and the practice of it. So mātauranga, knowledge about birds themselves, is only a small part of mātauranga, for example, but when we go out and harvest or observe or act, then that's a much fuller expression of what mātauranga is. And so here you can see that they're carving and also sharing that knowledge and that process with others. Next. So I won't dwell on this because I think Winona's provided some beautiful examples of how the rights of nature have been incorporated into legislation. This is just a recent example from Aotearoa, New Zealand, that acknowledges both the ancient and enduring forest of Te Urewera, but also its traditional guardians, Tūhoi. So both of these things are acknowledged within the Act. Now you might say, well, Antarctica doesn't have Indigenous peoples. That's true, of course, but there are many Indigenous peoples around the world whose perspectives can really help us transform how Antarctica is protected and passed on to future generations. So that in particular is where I think it's important that we have a really broad collective foundation for what we can do in the future. Next. And so this is Te Urewera as it looks now, and you can see that as with Antarctica, there is much that is wild and beautiful, but also that humans have a relationship within that wildness and beauty as well. So the question here for Antarctica is, how can we use these ideas of relationality? How can we bring them and value them to transform Antarctic management? And I think that the Antarctic Declaration is a really powerful way that aligns well with Indigenous thinking, where we can really do something that perhaps the current system cannot. So next. And so this is where we are now. We're asking the question, where do we need to go? And so I think the Antarctic Declaration is an incredibly valuable step that we're working so that it encompasses these ideas for all of humanity and for the world, for Antarctica itself. So yeah, kia ora tātou, that's it, thank you.
Kia ora tātou to you too. Thank you so much for that very inspiring presentation, Zilla. And if any questions, please put them in the chat box and our speakers can reply to you there. Our next speaker is Cormac Cullinan. Now, Cormac led the drafting on the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, proclaimed in April 2010 by the People's World Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in Bolivia. He is an environmental attorney and governance expert, a pioneer of Earth jurisprudence, a speaker and inspiring author, including the groundbreaking Wild Law, a manifesto for Earth justice. Cormac's residing in Cape Town, South Africa. He's the director of Enact International and the Wild Law Institute and sits on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. So Cormac, looking forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Before I'm going to take people quickly through the the outline of the Antarctica Declaration. But before I start, I thought I should just give some context. So what is very important if one's going to have a declaration or a people's document, if you like, if it's going to have an impact on the world, it's really important that it enjoys legitimacy and a credibility. And my belief is that that is produced primarily by the process which leads to the document. So in other words, you can have somebody in a back room draft a wonderful document, but it's unlikely to have legitimacy. And so part of the process we're engaged in here is to encourage many people in the world, including hopefully the participants in this conference, to contribute ideas and comments, etc., to the process of formulating and articulating this Antarctica Declaration. So what I'm going to be presenting now is really just some broad framework and ideas which are intended to stimulate discussion. It's by no means a finished product, and that's deliberately so. We don't want to present something for endorsement. We want to suggest ideas and hopefully elicit the help of many people in the world to contribute their ideas and really creativity to the process, so that what comes out of it benefits from a degree of legitimacy, that at least it's been a product of a very inclusive process. So what I'm going to do is just take you through, first of all, the general ideas as represented in the preamble, and then I'll pick up on a couple of the proposed articles and what they would cover, just so that you can get a sense of the kind of shape that a declaration like this might have, but bearing in mind, of course, that it is yet to be determined. It's very much a work in progress. Next slide, please. So here, I thought I would start by just giving an overview of the whole treaty the whole declaration as we conceive of it. So Article 1 would deal with Antarctica, defining what we mean by Antarctica. Article 2, the legal status of Antarctica. Article 3, the inherent rights and freedoms of Antarctica and its members. So the legal status in the previous one, we're seeing Antarctica as a being. In other words, it's not just a question of it's not territory or land, or seen as an inert object. Article 4 would deal with territorial claims. So this is controversial, but as many people know, and as was explained earlier, many countries have got claims to own part of Antarctica, and although they are currently frozen under the treaty system, they still remain there. Article 5 would deal with human relationships with Antarctica, because what we're proposing here is a very fundamental shift, which, as Scylla has said, aligns with Indigenous perspectives. And that is that if Antarctica is a being is essentially a living community composed of many beings and is a being itself, the question is, how should humans relate to Antarctica? The next article would be human duties to Antarctica, and Article 7 would be permissible human activities. Which activities are permissible in Antarctica? Next. Article 8, decision-making in relation to Antarctica. In other words, how should humans make decisions which affect Antarctica? 9, how should Antarctica be represented in human decision-making? In other words, if it's a being, should it, for example, be entitled to have a seat on the United Nations? Article 10, measures to implement the declaration. In other words, what changes should be made to the legal systems of different countries in order to give effect to the declaration? Article 9 would be dispute resolution. And obviously, this is something, obviously, as most indigenous systems in the world attempt to regard disputes as indicative of a breakdown in relationship, and dispute resolution is aimed primarily at restoring those relationships. In other words, it's restorative justice rather than punitive, in the sense determining who's wrong and punishing him, which most so-called justice systems in the world at the moment are oriented towards. And then Article 12, the relationship between the Declaration and existing treaties, and then definitions at the end. Next. I'm going to start by spending a little time with, we've done a draft of the preamble. It may change, of course, but we thought this was necessary to give a sense of what we're trying to do. So it starts off, we the peoples of Earth. In other words, this is human beings who are making this, but it's all human beings on Earth. It's not people of particular nation states who happen to have signed treaties or made claims on this area a long time ago. Celebrating the beautiful wild continent we know of as Antarctica, the surrounding waters of the Southern Ocean, and the communities of life that inhabit those awe-inspiring lands, ice, water, and skies. So I think it's important to celebrate and recognize the beauty and wildness of this being, which is truly awe-inspiring. Secondly, we move into gratitude, grateful for the magnificent community of interrelated ecological beings that constitute Antarctica, and the vital role that Antarctica plays in maintaining the ecological stability and health of the whole Earth community. And of course, as many of you will know, Antarctica plays an extraordinarily important role in maintaining the global climate, and is really vital for the stability of the whole community of Earth. Then we move to being conscious of the grave threats that some human activities pose to the health of this community, and of the disruptions that it is already experiencing due to global warming, ocean acidification, and activities such as commercial fishing. So this is not just a declaration for the sake of it. There are particular and grave threats which need to be addressed. Next. Then accepting our collective responsibilities, and this is, I think, particularly important. You know, we, the people of Earth, have a collective responsibility to safeguard Antarctica from harm by humans, and that swift, decisive, and far-reaching measures are necessary to prevent humans causing harms that they cannot remedy. So we really need to take collective responsibility for this. Inspired by our common aspiration to ensure that Antarctica may flourish now and in the future as an autonomous, self-regulating community, free from claims of ownership and harmful human influences. So this is, I think, recognizing a reality is that Antarctica is and always has been self-regulating. We are not in charge. We are not running Antarctica as human beings, and it knows how to regulate itself, if I can put it that way. And the most important thing is for us to accept that we're not in charge and to recognize its autonomy as a self-regulated community. Then we move on to proclaiming this Antarctic Declaration. It's a matter of contention as to whether we should also call on the General Assembly of the United Nations to adopt it. That'll be something we need to discuss further. And we call on all people's organizations and institutions to take responsibility for promoting the universal and effective recognition and observance of the rights and duties recognized in this declaration. So just like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everybody is responsible for taking action to ensure that this declaration is effectively, becomes effective throughout the world. Next. So the first article then would define what the Antarctic community encompasses, and that it is a holder of rights. In other words, it's not an object, property, which can be. It's not a property which can be moved, bought and sold. It is a being, and one of the important things here, I think, is that this article needs to communicate how we conceive of Antarctica. In other words, it's a living community of interdependent beings, and both biotic and abiotic, and it has both tangible and intangible dimensions, and it occurs within a specific geographical space. It might not be capable of being mapped precisely, but we need to give some idea of its extent. The next slide. Once we move on to the legal status of Antarctica, it's important, as previous speakers have said, to define it as it's not going to be a part. We try to say that it's not going to be subject to colonization. So the colonized, it's one of the very few, apart from the high seas, I think it's probably the only area on Earth left in which the colonial process wasn't completed. There are claims, but it's not owned by any nation state. And we say, let's move away from the concept of it being owned, that it must be self-regulated and autonomous, which is the reality. And it's a being beyond national jurisdiction. It's not subject to state sovereignty. And it's a legal subject with the capacity to hold rights and exercise freedoms. And it's also composed of members, which are also legal subjects with rights and freedoms. In other words, whales, penguins, krill, etc. Are members of this whole, but they in themselves are also subjects and not objects. Next, please. So if we talk about what the kinds of rights that Antarctica might have, rights and freedoms, just a few examples here. First, obviously, the right to life and to exist. It does exist, it has come into being, and it has the right to be and to continue existing. And obviously, that is threatened to some extent by climate change. It would have the right, the freedom to continue their vital cycles and processes free from human disruptions. So this, I think, is the essence of wildness that has been referred to a number of times. It's a wild continent, and wildness needs freedom. It needs to determine its own course. And the most important thing that we as humans must do is not interfere too much with those processes. The right to be respected by humans. I mean, this is something which Indigenous people understand very well, and it's about recognizing that just as we claim to have dignity as humans, and we expect other people to respect our dignity and our being, so too do ecological beings like Antarctica. And then the right to self-determination, which is analogous to right of self-determination for nation states. In other words, it's not going to be subject to management. It has the freedom to determine its own future. And when humans come there, we must approach it as respectful visitors. Next, please. Human relationships with Antarctica. I'm not going to go through all of the clauses. I'm just selecting a few so that you have a sense of what this might look like. This would set out principles that must be observed by humans and human institutions when relating to Antarctica and its members. And these are very much influenced by Indigenous ways of thinking, Indigenous understanding throughout the world. For example, respecting other beings, which you've already discussed, principles regarding relationality and reciprocity. So this is the idea that the most important thing is for us to maintain respectful and good relations with the members of the Antarctic community and with Antarctica as a whole. We are talking about a world of relationships here, not a world of dominance based on state sovereignty and control and power. And we need principles about making decisions on the basis of what will best promote the long-term integrity and health of Antarctica. In other words, this is the equivalent of the common good. Decision-making ought to be based on what is best for Antarctica as a whole. And then principles regarding taking responsibility for human actions. In other words, if people, citizens of a particular state are going to visit there, the state must take responsibility for ensuring that they behave properly, and there must be some mechanisms for ensuring that humans are held accountable for how they act in relation to Antarctica. Next.
Cormac, can we wrap up in a few minutes because we're running out of time for our session, if that's okay. We've got one more speaker. No problem. It's fascinating. Keep going. Thank you.
Well, let me, I can just go very quickly through these. This would define what activities would be permissible, and we particularly need to deal with activities outside of Antarctica, which have impacts on it. For example, the generation of greenhouse gases is really important. Next, please. This is about decision-making in relation to Antarctica. And this would be about how we make decisions that take into account those principles to make sure that they're taken in the interests of the whole. Next, please. Next. Okay, this would be the measures to implement the declaration. And one of the things that we're particularly interested in is that Antarctica should be entitled to be represented in national courts. In other words, you should be able to stand up in a court in Europe and say, I represent Antarctica, and I can tell you that what is being done here is having adverse impacts on my client. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cormac. Sorry to speed you up a little bit then. We do have your books to read, which I encourage everyone to do as well. Any questions, please just type them in the chat box, and Cormac and Scylla and Ricardo can have a look there to reply to you. Our final speaker is Yelena Yemakova. She has a PhD in political philosophy. Her interests include the governance of international spaces such as the polar regions, the deep seabed, cyberspace, atmosphere, and outer space. Specifically, her research focuses on which institutions should govern these spaces and also what makes these institutions legitimate. So looking forward to hearing from you, Yelena.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you for previous presentations. It's been an excellent session. So I won't actually have a presentation, but I will rather summarize the overall aim and the hopes of the initiative and then talk about the next steps. And I will share the screen in a little bit. So for the last year or so, we have discussed as a group the need of a document that would establish the rights of Antarctica and our duties towards Antarctica. And we believe that the current legal systems that Ricardo gave an overview of do not match the physical reality and the needs of physical reality, and that recognizing rights of Antarctica is essential to rock in this existing status quo, which is based on the colonial way of thinking, the way of thinking of exploitation and appropriation of resources. And it's based on the kind of way of thinking that Winona talked about in the beginning of the session. So it is hard to challenge the status quo unless there is an alternative vision. So this is what we really, to put it in a couple of sentences, this is what we are trying to do. The aim is to create such an alternative vision. The aim is to move away from this colonial way of thinking and towards the way of thinking that Scylla talked about, that views Antarctica as a living community that we as human beings ought to respect and protect. So the goal of the initiative is to have open to all process and have a democratically created declaration, to have a legitimate process, as Cormac mentioned, and to have it as inclusive as possible. So the declaration is to be launched on Earth Day, April 22nd, for signatures by states and NGOs. And we are looking for support and feedback, any of your thoughts, and for ideas how to spread the word. And let me just share the screen really quickly. Apologies. Okay, so just to move this here. So this is the webpage, antarcticarights.org. You can view the document that Cormac was presenting, but you can actually download the document, the zero draft, right here. And we welcome feedback, and you can submit it via Google form right here. That would be a more of a general questions. There are about 10 questions. If you are interested and willing to provide more detailed comments on the declaration, you can download the Word document right here and email it to info@antarcticarights.org. And then we welcome feedback by February 22nd, as mentioned here on the webpage, to give us a couple months to work through the comments and then have the declaration launch on April 22nd. So now I'm going to stop sharing. To clarify, as Cormac mentioned, we don't think of this as a final product that will be ready, as a final document that will be ready by April 22nd, but rather as a starting point to have the conversation going. And we want as much feedback as possible and have the process as inclusive as possible to all. So now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to open it for Q&A and welcome your thoughts.
There was a question there from Lizzie, if Cormac could discuss the designation of the Southern Ocean as it pertains to, I'm not quite sure what it was, Lizzie, but there was a question there about the designation of the Southern Ocean.
Could I ask Lizzie to explain the question a little bit more? I'm not sure that I understood it.
Lizzie, did you want to expand it? Was it designating it a sanctuary?
In response to, I believe it was Cormac in the chat talking about the territorial waters and their measurement from the landmass, and
yes,
regarding that.
Okay, so the question, I did read the question. Thank you. It as I understood it, it's talking about how you how the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea specifies the rules for determining territorial waters, and measuring from land and baselines, etc. So we wouldn't be starting from that point of view. We would be starting from the point of view from a natural point of view. What are what is the extent of this being? The upwellings, the wind currents, etc., that swirl around the poles. What is the extent of this ecosystem of this community as a whole? And so we wouldn't be following the rules of UNCLOS in determining the extent of its territorial seas, etc. We would be saying that this is it as a being. But there are particular challenges, obviously, because if you take, for example, the whales that mainly live there, but then they come up to carve along South Africa, for example, and they move up and then go and move back. So we've been having discussions about, in a sense, they would be like citizens of Antarctica, but who are sometimes outside of the jurisdiction. And so what would their status be as citizens of Antarctica by analogy when they were out of the area? So it is a valid question about the extent of the territorial sea, but we would not feel bound by the existing treaties in defining Antarctica as a being.
I'm going to ask if we can go for 5 minutes longer. Please, our tech support team there.
Yes, you're fine.
Thank you very much. There's also a question from Alan in the chat box, Alan Brown. Are territorial waters measured from landmass only? And if not, should landmass be considered measured from ice shields? And if Antarctic territorial waters were to be measured from ice shields, should ice shields of historic reach be considered as maritime territorial waters for Antarctica? That's part one, and the second one's on fishing rights. So who wants to take the first part of the question?
That's what I was addressing.
Okay. All right. So the next part is, should fishing rights be denied to foreign nationals because of maritime rights to territorial waters? Ricardo, are you the right one for that? Or Cormac, Ricardo? Yep. Ricardo, you're on mute. You're on mute. That's it.
Repeat the question.
The question was, should fishing rights be denied to foreign nations because of maritime rights to territorial waters, 200 nautical miles and 12 nautical miles?
Yeah, I think what are foreign nations? All nations are foreign in the Antarctic. That's number one. And the other one is, as I put in my response, the Southern Ocean in the Antarctic Treaty area, and also in much of the Camellar area, if you recall that map with the boundaries in yellow, much of that is the high seas under UNCLOS. So there might be some claims somewhere, but most of it is, especially in the Antarctic Treaty area, south of 60 degrees south, all of that is the high seas. So the fishing rights or fishing access is controlled by the Camellar Convention I referred to. And of course, there are issues as to who can be part of Camellar and what is the how Camellar allows or not fishing and so on. But that's sort of essentially regulated at the moment. I don't know if that answers the question of. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a comment also about Norway and the Norwegian involvement in Antarctica, and if the Greens in Norway can be lobbying the Norwegian government on this issue more. Is anyone here from Norway on the call? That's something we can put on our to-do list, to contact the Greens in Norway, perhaps.
But can I just, it said that Ricardo wanted to answer this question live, because I think there's an important, that comment also said that the elephant in the room is Russian Greens. Ricardo, did you have something to say about it? I don't know if that was by mistake, but it said that you wanted to answer live.
I don't know about. I think it will be very interesting to find out what the Norwegian Greens are willing to do. I mean, Norway is a claimant state, and it's also a fishing state. It's the #1 krill fishing nation on Earth. So I don't know how they would react. As to the Russian Greens, I don't know anything about them. Of course, Russia is a difficult country in many ways. So it would be interesting to see whether some sort of democratic push from within can help the situation in any way. Thank you.
Maybe the not-for-profit sector in Russia is another possibility to the NGO community.
That is just also follow up on that. That is one of the feedback we're also trying to get is from some of the youth communities in Russia on the declaration. So hopefully we'll see what feedback we get after the deadline of February 22nd. But we have been in contact with some of the young early career researchers in Russia who work on the polar regions.
Excellent. Yelena, did you want to give some closing statement then to the group?
Did you say me?
Yeah.
Well, the closing statement is we hope we get feedback from you, from everyone. And then there's actually a comment from Lizzie in the chat, whether we have advice on how groups and organizations should forward the discussion. We were hoping, I think we will, this is the hope for this Congress and participating in this session, I think, was to build the momentum and have this collective thinking. We were hoping to get the ideas of how to share this. I understand that Lisa said that you see it as a responsibility as being to share with people historic and marginalized. I think one of the aims to have a document by April 22nd, and as Cormac said, not a final document, but something that we can actually present that can be shown, that NGOs and different groups can use to show and start the conversation to get more feedback so the document keeps on evolving. But other than that, please email us at info@antarcticarights.org, and we hope to get feedback by February 22nd.
Thank you, Yelena, and a big thank you to our panelists, Ricardo, Cormac, and Yelena, and a big thank you to Diane for starting the session, and to Waramu as well, and to Lizzie for all your work, and for Winona for her great video contribution too. So let's keep talking about this. I hope we can keep networking on it, Lizzie. And yeah, it's a really important issue at this juncture in time to keep carrying forward. All right, everybody, enjoy the rest of the conference. There's a couple more sessions left. I'm starting to losing my voice. I've been going for quite some hours, so 2 more sessions left.
I believe this is your 4th session, so take a break,
Yes.
Michelle.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Good night and good morning.